They call me Rosa, but if you've worked long nights in a morgue like I have, names don't hold much weight. I've spent the past 7 years at St. Miriam's Hospital in a quiet coastal town, where my job is to prepare the deceased for their final journey. It's not glamorous, and it's certainly not for the faint of heart. I've heard all the tales, bodies twitching, eyes fluttering open, voices whispering in the silence. None of that ever happened to me, and frankly, I didn't believe it ever would. At least not until the night everything changed. It was a humid evening in June 1987, the kind of night where the air sticks to your skin and even the faintest breeze feels like a blessing. I was assigned to examine a woman who had been brought in earlier that day. She was in her late 30s with delicate features and a serene expression that seemed almost too peaceful for someone so young. The file said her name was Elena Vargas, and the preliminary cause of death was undetermined. As I began the examination, I noticed something peculiar. Her fingertips were slightly discolored, a bluish tinge that hinted at something toxic. Poison, perhaps. I noted it down and proceeded with the autopsy, careful and methodical as always. There was nothing out of the ordinary, at least at first. When I finished, I disposed of my gloves and started tidying up. That's when it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her hand move, just a slight twitch, like a muscle memory triggered by some distant echo of life. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. It wasn't unusual for corpses to exhibit post-mortem spasms. I told myself that it was nothing, just a trick of nerves, and went back to cleaning. But then, a strange scent filled the room. It wasn't the antiseptic odor of the morgue or the faint metallic tang of blood. It was something entirely out of place. A cologne, rich and smoky, unmistakably masculine. The scent was so strong it made my head spin. I froze, staring at the still body on the table. There was no logical explanation for what I was experiencing. Unable to shake the unease creeping up my spine, I left the room, telling myself I just needed a break. I didn't mention it to anyone, partly because I didn't want to sound insane, and partly because I couldn't explain it myself. Hours later, another body arrived. A man this time around 40, with a robust build and sharp features. His name was Diego Vargas. The cause of death: a sudden cardiac arrest at home. I opened the file and immediately felt the blood drain from my face. Diego was Elena's husband. The moment I approached his body, that same cologne hit me again, even stronger this time. My hands trembled as I set up my tools. I tried to focus, but my mind raced with questions. How could the scent of his cologne have been on her body earlier? And why was it now emanating from his? I kept working, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. But as I prepared to make the first incision, the lights in the room flickered. My breath caught as the air around me grew colder, the kind of cold that burrows into your bones. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. That's when I noticed something I'll never forget. Diego's face wasn't as calm as it had been when they brought him in. His expression had changed. His lips were slightly parted, his brow furrowed, as if he were in the middle of a silent argument. And his eyes, though firmly shut, seemed strained, as if they might burst open at any moment. I couldn't do it. I couldn't keep working. I sealed the room and left, my mind reeling. Later, I overheard the transport team discussing Diego's death. He had been with family grieving his wife when he suddenly screamed. His last words were chilling. "She's here! Elena's here!" To this day, I don't know what truly happened. If Elena was poisoned, as I suspected, Diego was the only logical suspect. But if guilt killed him, it did so with an uncanny swiftness. The perfume, the flickering lights, the change in their expressions, it all felt like something far beyond my understanding. You can call it a coincidence, a psychological trick, or even a curse. But whatever it was, it left a mark on me that no amount of reason or time can erase. When I first started working at a small private clinic in the quaint coastal town of San Javier, I was fresh out of medical school, full of ambition, and eager to prove myself. It wasn't a big city hospital or a prestigious institution, but it was perfect for honing my skills. The year was 2002, and my mentor was Dr. Ricardo. a man whose reputation as a brilliant pathologist preceded him. He was in his mid-50s, with a quiet demeanor and a knack for making even the most complex procedures seem straightforward. Dr. Ricardo had a unique way of teaching. He never rushed through an explanation, often weaving stories from his years of experience into his lessons. He once told me, "The dead don't lie, Mariana. Their bodies are like books, and we are the readers trying to decipher the truth." His words stayed with me, fueling my curiosity and respect for the profession. One evening, as the orange hues of the setting sun filtered through the clinic windows, Dr. Ricardo told me he was considering retiring soon. The news caught me off guard. "Who will guide me then?" I asked, half joking but genuinely unsettled by the idea of losing his mentorship. He chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're ready," he said. "You just don't realize it yet." A week later, Dr. Ricardo announced he was taking some time off. "A little break to clear my head," he said, though there was something in his tone that made me think he wasn't telling me everything. He didn't specify when he'd return, but he left with his usual calm assurance, patting my shoulder as he walked out of the clinic. His absence was palpable. The clinic felt quieter, the air heavier. A temporary replacement, Dr. Sophia, was assigned to oversee my work. She was kind and capable, but she wasn't Dr. Ricardo. I missed his steady presence, especially as my first solo shift loomed closer. The night before I was to officially work unsupervised, a body arrived at the morgue. It was a man in his late 40s who had died under unclear circumstances. Dr. Sophia handed me the case and left me to begin. As I was about to make the first incision, the door creaked open. To my astonishment, Dr. Ricardo walked in, his usual composed self. "I couldn't let you face this milestone alone," he said, smiling. Relief washed over me. "I'm so glad you're here," I said, genuinely touched by his gesture. He stood beside me as I worked, offering quiet encouragement and guidance, just as he always had. The procedure went smoothly, and when I finished, I turned to thank him. He nodded, his smile warm but tinged with an unspoken finality. "You're ready now, Mariana," he said. "You'll do just fine." Then he turned and walked out of the room. Minutes later, Dr. Sophia entered, her face pale and drawn. She hesitated before speaking. "Mariana, I have some difficult news. Dr. Ricardo passed away earlier today." I stared at her, my mind racing. "That's not possible," I said. "He was just here." He guided me through the entire procedure. She looked at me with a mix of pity and disbelief, but I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. Later that night, I was tasked with performing Dr. Ricardo's autopsy. As I worked, tears blurred my vision. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. When I finally looked at his face, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. His lips were curved in a faint, peaceful smile, as if he'd known he would be there for me one last time. To this day, I carry his words and his teachings with me. And though I can't explain what happened that night, I know it was his way of saying goodbye. It wasn't just a farewell. It was a reminder that even in death, he was still my guide. It started with an email. Simple, routine. The sort of thing that usually passed through my inbox without stirring a ripple. But this time, something about it unsettled me. The subject read, "Urgent unclaimed case, full prep required." I'd been working at Hawthorne Memorial as a mortuary assistant for nearly 6 months. And while the job wasn't exactly a cocktail party conversation starter, it paid the bills and offered me a strange sense of purpose. I'm Aaron, 29 years old, painfully average in most ways. I didn't grow up thinking I'd end up working in a morgue, but life has a way of steering you into unexpected alleys. Hawthorne Memorial was an old brick hospital in the heart of Chicago, with creaky elevators and dim hallways that seemed better suited for a horror movie than modern medicine. The email had come from Dr. Florence McAllister, the senior pathologist. She was meticulous and distant, the kind of person whose presence felt heavier than her actual frame. She rarely contacted me directly, so her message felt off even before I opened it. When I arrived that evening, the hospital corridors were quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making every sound feel like an intrusion. As I walked toward the mortuary suite, I noticed the faint flicker of a light at the end of the hall, like a fluorescent bulb trying to cling to life. Inside the prep room, everything was as I'd left it that morning. Stainless steel counters gleamed under the harsh overhead lights, the faint smell of disinfectant lingering in the air. The paperwork for the unclaimed body was clipped to a clipboard on the counter. I glanced at it and felt an odd chill run down my spine. The name was missing. Just a blank space where it should have been. Age blank. Date of death blank. Cause of death, natural causes, but no additional details. Weird, but not impossible. Sometimes records were incomplete, especially for unclaimed bodies. What bothered me more was the note scrawled at the bottom of the page. Proceed with basic preservation. Deliver to viewing room 3 by midnight. I'd never seen a delivery deadline like that before. The body was supposed to be in chamber 9. I pushed the handle down, the heavy door giving way with a reluctant groan. The inside was lined with shelves, each holding a figure draped in white sheets. I found the tag for chamber 9 and pulled the gurney forward. When I peeled back the sheet, I froze. The woman's face stared back at me, not in the lifeless, serene way I was used to, but with a faint, unnatural smirk. Her lips were curled just slightly, enough to make my stomach knot. She was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, with deep-set wrinkles and pale, waxy skin. Around her wrist was a bracelet made of black beads, with a single golden charm dangling from it. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine as I prepared to move her to the prep table. But as I placed my hand on the gurney, I swore I felt the faintest warmth radiating from her body. Impossible, I told myself, just my imagination. The procedures went smoothly at first. Cleaning, embalming. It was almost automatic for me by now. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. When I began stitching an incision, the lights flickered. Just a brief stutter, but enough to make my hands falter. I glanced at the woman's face and stopped cold. Her smirk was wider now, unmistakably smug, as though she knew something I didn't. I stepped back, my heart racing. Pull it together, Aaron, I muttered to myself, trying to focus. But then the room temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath forming clouds in front of me, and the light flickering grew more erratic. I grabbed my phone to check the time. 11:30 p.m. I needed to finish soon. As I reached for the woman's wrist to remove the bracelet, the room plunged into complete darkness. The hum of the fluorescent lights died, replaced by an oppressive silence. My breath quickened, and I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in my pocket. When I turned it on, the beam swept across the room, landing on the woman's face. Her eyes were open. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind raced to rationalize what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. Her lifeless gaze seemed fixed on me, and her smirk had grown into a wide grin. The flashlight flickered, and in that moment, I heard a whisper. It wasn't coming from the hallway or the vents. It was right there, in the room with me. Aaron. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked in place. The voice was faint, almost playful, but unmistakably real. I scanned the room with the flashlight, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the body, her hand was dangling off the table, pointing toward the door. I don't remember running out of the room, but I found myself in the hallway, gasping for air. My hands were shaking as I dialed Dr. McAllister's number. She didn't answer. I called security next, managing to stammer out what had happened. By the time they arrived, the body was gone. The prep table was empty, the bracelet lying on the floor where her hand had been. Security reviewed the camera footage, but it showed nothing unusual. The body hadn't left the room. The next morning, I was called back to the hospital. A new body had been found. An elderly woman discovered in the hospital parking lot, her face frozen in the same eerie grin I'd seen the night before. Around her wrist was a bracelet identical to the one I'd seen earlier, and clenched in her hand was a black ring with a golden charm. Dr. McAllister didn't say much as she handed me the paperwork, but as I glanced at the new file, my heart sank. The name, age, and details were all blank. I remember it vividly, though I often wish I didn't. It was the early 2000s, and I'd been working as a pathology assistant in a small, understaffed clinic on the outskirts of my hometown. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I'd grown oddly accustomed to the quiet dread that came with working in the morgue. One chilly evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, casting the city in muted hues of grey and gold, I got an unexpected call. I'd just finished cleaning up after a routine autopsy when the secretary waved me over to the front desk. "It's urgent," she whispered, handing me the receiver. The voice on the other end was deep and authoritative. Mr. Holt, the owner of the clinic. He rarely spoke to anyone, much less called directly. I straightened up, bracing myself. "In an hour," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. "A body will be arriving, a child." My stomach tightened. It wasn't the first time we'd handled a child's body, but something about his voice set me on edge. "Store it in the cold chamber. No one is to approach the morgue except you. Understand?" The line went dead before I could respond. When the body arrived, it came in a sleek, unmarked van. 2 men in dark suits unloaded the stretcher, their movements mechanical. Behind them stood a woman, cloaked in a black coat that swayed in the wind. Her face was pale, her eyes hollowed by what seemed like years of grief. She didn't say a word. As they wheeled the stretcher toward me, she lingered near the van, staring at the clinic's facade with an eerie stillness. The child was small, no older than 6. His skin was a strange bluish hue, his tiny hands curled into fists. The signs of drowning were unmistakable: swollen features, a faint sickly odor of salt water. I bit back the lump rising in my throat as I prepared to slide him into the cold chamber. But just before I did, I whispered a quiet prayer, my hands trembling. Then I heard it, a soft, mournful cry, barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. It was the kind of sound that digs into your chest, pulling at your heartstrings. I froze, straining my ears. The crying grew louder, more anguished, and seemed to echo from the hallway outside. I stepped out, expecting to find the grieving woman, but the corridor was empty. That's when I noticed Marcus, one of the night janitors, standing stiffly at the end of the hall. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "You heard it too?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, unsure of what to say. Before I could speak, the crying grew louder, sharper, as if it were coming from the morgue itself. Marcus and I exchanged a look, a silent agreement to investigate despite the cold dread settling over us. Back in the morgue, the temperature felt unnaturally low, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. The sound was deafening now, a woman's wail filled with sorrow so profound it made my chest ache. The source was unmistakable. It was coming from the cold chamber where the boy's body lay. Marcus clutched my arm as we edged closer, my breath fogged in the frigid air. "This isn't possible," he muttered, his voice shaking. "There's no one else here." And then we saw her. The woman from the van stood by the cold chamber, her long black coat trailing behind her as if caught in an unseen breeze. But something was different. Her face was bruised and sunken, her eyes bloodshot and staring into nothingness. Her hands, skeletal and trembling, hovered over the chamber door. She didn't turn to look at us, but the wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. In a single fluid motion, she opened the chamber door and gazed at the boy's lifeless body. Her face twisted into an expression of raw agony, and then she let out a scream so piercing, so inhuman, that I clamped my hands over my ears. The lights flickered violently, and the room seemed to spin. When I dared to look again, she was gone. The cold chamber was closed, and the boy's body lay undisturbed inside. Marcus and I bolted from the morgue, our hearts racing. The following day, I confronted Mr. Holt. I demanded to know who the woman was and why the boy had been brought to our clinic under such strange circumstances. He seemed genuinely confused, insisting that no woman had accompanied the body. The boy's family, he explained, was prominent and private. They'd lost him in a tragic accident, and the clinic was chosen simply to avoid unwanted attention. But I knew what I'd seen and heard. Marcus did too. We never spoke of it again, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear that wailing in my dreams. It's a sound that doesn't leave you, a reminder of that cold, suffocating night and the sorrow that lingers long after death. It was late in the summer of 2015 when I found myself patrolling the outskirts of a quiet village nestled between rolling hills. The town was mostly farmland, with only a handful of people scattered across its modest homes. My name is Ethan Calloway, and I was fresh into my second year as a constable. The job came with long hours, endless paperwork, and the occasional run-in with the unexpected. That night, however, turned into something I could never have anticipated. The air felt heavier than usual, the kind of stillness that makes you uneasy for reasons you can't quite explain. My partner Grace and I were covering for another unit in this rural area. We had just finished responding to a noise complaint at a barn party when we spotted a figure stumbling toward the road. At first, we thought it might have been a drunk trying to find their way home, but as we slowed the cruiser and our headlights illuminated the person, my gut twisted. She couldn't have been older than 19 or 20. Her clothes hung from her frame, tattered and smeared with dirt, and her hair was a tangled mess that looked like it hadn't been brushed in years. She waved weakly, her movements sluggish and disjointed, before collapsing onto her knees. Grace jumped out of the car while I radioed for an ambulance. Up close, her condition was worse than I thought. Her skin clung to her bones, her face pale and gaunt. When she spoke, her voice cracked like it hadn't been used in weeks. "Help! They're still in there," she whispered, pointing a trembling finger toward a dilapidated farmhouse on a hill. We exchanged a glance. Neither of us wanted to leave her, but we couldn't ignore what she said. Grace stayed with her while I grabbed my flashlight and approached the house. The structure looked as if it had been forgotten by time. Shutters hanging off their hinges, paint peeling in large flakes, and windows coated in grime. The front door was ajar, creaking slightly as the wind toyed with it. Inside, the air reeked of mildew and something far worse, a sickly sweet stench that turned my stomach. My flashlight's beam wavered as I stepped over broken furniture and scattered debris. The house seemed abandoned, but then I heard it, a faint muffled sobbing coming from somewhere upstairs. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but the thought of someone trapped or hurt kept me moving. As I ascended the creaky staircase, the crying grew louder, more desperate. I pushed open the first door I came to and found a woman bound to a chair, her face streaked with tears. She flinched when my light landed on her, and it took a moment before she realized I wasn't one of them. "It's okay," I said, rushing to untie her. Her wrists were red and raw, and she winced as the ropes fell away. "Are you alone? Is there anyone else here?" She shook her head frantically. "Down the hall," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's another." I led her to the landing where Grace was waiting. She took the girl and urged me to be careful. The sobbing continued, more guttural now, coming from the last door at the end of the hall. My heart pounded as I pushed it open, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The room was empty, save for a few broken pieces of furniture, but the sobbing persisted, echoing as if coming from all directions. Then I saw her. She stood in the far corner, her back to me. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her frame was thin, almost skeletal. She wore a dress that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, though it was torn and stained with something dark. My throat went dry as I called out to her, "Ma'am, are you all right?" She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so oppressive it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Slowly she began to turn, and as her face came into view, my blood ran cold. Her eyes were hollow voids, leaking dark, viscous tears, and her mouth was twisted in an expression of pure anguish. A scream caught in my throat as the temperature in the room plummeted. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as she let out a wail so piercing it felt like it was tearing through my skull. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The next thing I remember is waking up outside, lying on the cold, damp ground. Grace was shaking me, her voice frantic. The girls we'd rescued were in the ambulance, and more officers were swarming the property. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion, a trick of the mind, but I couldn't shake the memory of her face. In the weeks that followed, we learned the farmhouse had been used by a trafficking ring, but the perpetrators had abandoned it days before we arrived. The two girls we rescued were the last victims they'd left behind. What haunted me most, though, was what the younger girl said before she was discharged from the hospital. "She's still in that house," she whispered, clutching my arm. "She cries for the ones who didn't make it." I never went back to that farmhouse, but I've heard the stories from locals who've tried to reclaim the property. They speak of a woman's wails echoing through the night, of shadows that move on their own. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I'll never forget the look in her eyes. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear her crying.